introduction about what this topic is about and who I am. So firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak. My name's Mandy Chessell, and I'm a distinguished engineer at IBM. And my main focus at the moment is to lead an open source project called ODPI Ageria. And its role is to actually change the way that tools exchange information. And I'm talking about tools for different types of professionals. So we're thinking about, say, governance officers, business executives, developers, testers, DevOps people. So everybody in a business are all using tools. They're using data. They're making decisions about digital services. And the role of Ageria is really to start to exchange that knowledge between different tools to ensure an organization operates at the highest efficiency. So this particular talk, I'm going to focus on a particular regulation called GDPR, which is a privacy regulation, and show how this type of technology can be used to help to basically improve the efficiency around the DevOps pipeline. So I'm going to focus on privacy because it's something that is becoming increasingly important all over the world. The European Union created a regulation called GDPR, which has led to a rush of similar regulation around the world. It's interesting in that it's very, very pervasive when it comes to the way that IT systems are written and operated as well. So it certainly wasn't written with IT systems in mind, but it has this huge impact. The first reason is that the definition of personal data, which is the data that this regulation protects, is very, very broad, and it's really anything that might identify an individual. So you start to get to things like IP addresses of phones become personal data because they're a thing that you use as an individual. So, and this is why it's had this huge knock-on effect across the industry. So one of the things that the impact of this is that actually almost every type of digital service, so this is a service that you're offering to an external customer that is working with data, pretty much has personal data in it, because even the individual has to log on and create a profile. And if you're monitoring how they're using the service, well, you're collecting personal data. Anything they try and do, anything that's specifically for them or about them becomes very important. And the things that we think are quite coarse-grained about certain aspects of an address or different types of characteristics can actually in themselves be, when you think about different types of minorities, they become very easy to identify as individuals. And so this also creates additional requirements when it comes to processing data to make sure that these individuals, just because they happen to be part of a minority, are being prepared. So for many organizations, it's a lot easier to assume that all the data it's processing, unless you're doing something that is a long way away from people, it's a lot easier to assume that all the data is personal and to start thinking about it in that term, or certainly every project needs to consider the management of personal data. So what do we need to do? When we think about what the privacy law is telling us, it's saying that we need to know exactly where personal data is located. So every time we build a new digital service, we're probably going to have, it's going to probably store data in different places. And whether this is in a containerized microservice, it's going to call back to a data service somewhere, which may not be in the same place as the actual service has been deployed. So it becomes very important that, particularly when we think about the DevOps pipeline, to ensure that the knowledge is captured as these services are deployed, because it's not like we've got one computer, so it's all on that computer. This is becoming, you know, a very complex environment with different parts of the service, maybe on a particular cloud provider, or maybe running in and another part running in the internal data system, the data center. So, you know, we do need to be really capturing that knowledge as to where the data is being located. DevOps pipeline also needs to make sure that it's pushing data to a secure, safe and secure location. We need to make sure that we understand the certifications associated with different types of computing environments, because it doesn't matter if, for example, where there's test data, that the system might be not as well locked down as the production data that actually puts real information into the database. And then the thing that's actually very hard is to be able to detect in the production environment that something has gone wrong, someone has basically broken into it, data has been lost, corrupted, or and that corruption has caused an impact on somebody because maybe an AI model ran incorrectly because of that data corruption. And so the ability in a production environment to say, well, wait a minute, this system's been compromised. What data was it using? What data did that give access to? And most importantly, who is impacted and what needs to be done to recover? It requires actually quite a lot of knowledge to be captured in terms of the design of the system, how it was deployed, and how it is being operated. Because regulations like GDPR give a company 72 hours to actually discover that information and report that something's gone wrong. So that knowledge needs to be there at their fingertips, so to be able to react to a particular incident. So this picture here, I'm showing the sort of major phases that a digital service goes through. And within each of these phases is actually a team of people doing their development process, we say. So in the digital services planning space, there are business people, architects, thinking through what's the next phase of developing this digital service, or even deciding to build a brand new one. So they're really looking at the value, they're looking at what types of data they're likely to need, what and what sort of at a high level types of precautions they need to think about. When we get into the next phase, the digital service development, this is where we're building the software. So we're going to do the standard design, build, and test. But the regulation requires attention to be paid to the fact that the data is, the use of personal data is absolutely minimized, and the logic allows an individual to control exactly how their data is being used. So this will impact the way that the system is being designed. That is of interest at the moment, and and so this is where the knowledge from the planning and the development stage is actually used to ensure that the right information is deployed. And I'll go through an example to show you exactly how that works. Then we have the service in deployment, and a new customer comes along and builds a profile. That's when they set up their preferences that the software will use to determine how the process is going. Then the digital service use aspect is the person using it. And then finally, we have to cope with the fact that while it's being used, then we have an incident such as a data breach happening. So these are the sort of major phases. And if we then look at, from a regulatory point of view, what else needs to happen? What additional information needs to be captured throughout that process? You can see that there's a need to identify what, right at that planning stage, the value of the data and what types of data will be needed for the service. And then the impact on an individual if that data is lost. So right up the early phases, there needs to be information gathered that adds additional requirements to the development team. Then in the development processing phase, the development team need to build what's called a data processing description for the different purposes, the different types of processing, for, I don't know, gathering usage statistics or creating a new account or whatever. Each of these things that it does, there needs to be a description of the purpose of the data and then exactly what happens to the data, how long it's kept, where it's stored, all that sort of thing. And that then is then used when somebody signs up to the system to say that for them to be able to say, yes, I agree that you can use this for marketing, you cannot use it for performance analysis, etc., etc. So that's all the sort of different things that they can sign up to. So these data processing descriptions also identify where the personal data is located. And this becomes very important. So you might have 3 or 4 different data services that are being used by your microservice, and only one of them has got personal data in it. So as we come through to the point where we want to deploy the technology, only one of the data services needs to go on to that highly secure server that has all that additional protection and monitoring around it, because all the personal data has been located in one place, and the other services have less requirements. So as we come into that DevOps process, we really need to know where that sensitive data is, where the processing on it is going to happen, and how it's being and how it will be controlled. So that's and what we're really trying to do is make sure that the information that's coming from the development team is encoded in a way that the DevOps pipeline can be automated to make sure the deployment happens in the right way. The other thing that happens is as people sign up to the service, often you have a contract and there's a sort of whole long list of descriptions on what you're agreeing to on this onboarding piece. So this is the contract, including the data use descriptions. And this will be all the things that you're agreeing to by default. And then as you're using the service, you may be able to turn some things on and off in your preferences as we go forward. So these are the sort of different types of technologies and processing that we need to capture. And when you're using something like Agile, Agile is enabling all of the tools associated with all these different phases to have access to that knowledge about where the personal data is, how it's being processed, so that the sort of later stages, the use, the personal management, data management, and the incident management can all be handled as efficiently as possible. So what I wanted to do was to take you through a very practical example of how this type of processing is it can be made made to be automated, particularly around the DevOps pipeline area. So one of the things when you look at the regulation, it starts with a definition of what personal data is. So it talks about things like your name and your date of birth and your citizenship and your passport number. So there's a great long list and a definition of what that data is and how it should be treated. And there's different grades of personal data it basically is graded based on how how much of an impact it has on the individual who has this who data about, if we lose that data or we damage that data, what is the impact it will have on the individual? So the first thing you can do is to take those definitions and basically create definitions of all the data that we care about. If we then think about APIs, and that's APIs and stores, there's two main things that developers need to deal with. If we can get to a point where we have standardized structures that say, this is the way you represent a customer, this is the way you represent a service that a customer is using, this is the way that you represent a payment from that person. And you can build these schemas and then attach to them tags that say how they represent, how they tie to the definitions of the data in the regulation. So that's this marked up schema idea, and then that information tools. So if you imagine you're using Swag tooling, you say, I want to build an API to build a customer profile, and I type in customer, I would then get the schema included directly into my new API with all these tags in it. That means that the developer is very efficient because they got nicely defined schemas. But when that API is finished, it can be then and it goes into the DevOps pipeline. That markup in the schema can be interpreted by the DevOps pipeline to ensure that this particular API or this particular data store is working with personal data. So it needs to be deployed onto our secure platform, as opposed to this data doesn't have that particular requirements, can go on an alternative place. So we're using knowledge that's been gathered from the regulation to ensure that, firstly, that the developer is much more efficient and uses and is able to build things much faster because we've got these predefined schemas, and then also that the DevOps pipeline operates automatically to push the data to the right, push the software components to the right deployment environments, which will then allow the things to go on. So, in conclusion, what we're saying is that the more we can embed the knowledge about data into the artifacts that are consumed by developers, and then with that tagging in place, we can then use automation in the DevOps pipeline to look at those tags and look up the requirements associated with it, and then drive automated specialized deployment processes from that information. So that is the end of my presentation. I know we have a Q&A session later on, so I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for the great session, Mandy.
Welcome.
Yeah, we will just wait for the questions to come.
Okay. We also have a Q&A session afterwards as well, don't we? We have the panel session too.
Yeah, the panel session is an open Q&A session, so the audience will put in questions and all the speakers will give in their views.
Yeah, that's right. So there's opportunities if you think about another question a bit later on at that time as well.
Yeah. So we will wait for 2 more minutes for the questions.
Okay. So, so we got the role of, the question is, what is the role of configuration management in DevOps? So what configuration management does is it creates a repository of descriptions of all the different infrastructure, hardware, software, and the software components, and where they're located and how they're connected together and what their levels are. And it provides also the ability to raise effectively defects or issues against that and manage the infrastructure. So that's what we call a metadata repository. It's one of the metadata repositories that's needed in in that broader ecosystem that I was talking about. And so the DevOps pipeline can use the configuration management tool to control, basically to say, okay, give me a list of different servers that I can put this particular service on. So it provides a sort of reference data set for the DevOps pipeline. And the next question is, why has DevOps gained prominence in the last few years? And I think it's because we're doing more. We need to get to the point where the systems are becoming so complex that we need to be able to automate the flow of software components into the infrastructure in a way that's automated and traceable, so that we can find out where what we've got and where it is. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mandy, for the session.
Okay.
So if we have any more questions coming in, we will take them. Oh, there is another one question. What are the best practices for DevOps implementation?
Okay, so I would say the best practice is really to think about how do you find out where everything is, and how do you deploy it in the most efficient automated manner. So really what you're thinking about is proper cataloging of everything you have, automation through a set of well-defined rules driven by the settings, that, particularly in a regulated world, that pushes through to infrastructure that is properly cataloged as well. So you are maintaining a complete audit trail and an automation process around